All right, I think we're going to get started. Everything looks good here. So again, I would like to welcome everybody to our fourth webinar in our 5-part webinar series on multi-tiered systems of support. Today, our focus is evidence-based practice and data use. So again, welcome, and we'll do some introductions in just a second. And this is our agenda for today. So we will talk about some key, we'll do a review of learning and then talk about some key vocabulary as related to evidence-based practices. We'll talk about data, and then we'll wrap up and look forward to our next and final session. Ooh, Tammy, the screen is like kind of there. Yeah, try again. There we go, perfect. Awesome. So of course, we're happy to have you with us today. As you know, you will get a follow-up email with a link to slides, a PD certificate for the hour that you spend with us, and any handouts or resources that we are including here in this slide deck will all come to you in an email from Beth Dion, who works with us. We definitely encourage you to participate. So you are welcome to use the Q&A for question answer. You're welcome to throw feedback into the chat. The only thing is, because we're in webinar, because we have such a high number of participants, which is wonderful, we are no longer in that meeting format, so we can't have dialogue. You're muted, but again, I know we've offered this in the past and we have had some takers. If you do have any, really specific questions that you wanted to ask at the very end of the webinar and wanted to hang on until we stop recording, you're welcome to do that, and we can unmute you at that time. And of course, we value your feedback. Oops, we do. It's okay. We value your feedback. And so we have a feedback survey for you. We've actually been making tweaks to this webinar series based on feedback that we've been receiving from you after each session. So please do take just a minute or so to fill that out. It's just a couple of questions, but it really does help us out. Awesome. So who we are Demonstrated Success. We are a K-12 educational consulting company based out of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I know we have a lot of New Hampshire folks on the call with us, but we also have folks from across New England and even out west. So we're really excited to have such a great group. We offer customized professional development and tailored school support, and you can see the areas on the screen. I'm happy to have a conversation with you if you have something in particular that you're looking to bring to your school, and we can help you. So this is your team today. Tammy Hilton is on the call. I'm Lauren. I'm Lauren Mercier, and Karen Matzo, who is our professional development director. She will actually be on the call. So if you see her appear in the tile on your screen, we are expecting her. So she will join us in just a little bit. Great. So again, part 4 of a 5-part series. May 18th is our last webinar in this series, and we'll talk a little bit more about supporting students on the continuum in our MTSS framework and making MTSS doable. So that's what we've been talking about for the last month or two in these webinars. So we are hosting a 2-day workshop, and we've talked to several of you already, which we're really excited about, to bring your teams of 3 to 6 people, ideally, to do some good work. So we will, as you can see the agenda, I won't read it all to you, but we have a 2-day in-person workshop that we're hosting at Manchester Community College right here in Manchester, New Hampshire. And we'll talk more specifically about behavior, SEL in terms of supports and strategies. We will also work on your specific plan. We'll talk about academic supports, enrichment. We will talk about, again, effective data use, building a supportive climate, and all the protocols, the teamwork that we've been talking about here. So basically, we're going to have customized time for you to work as a team to get this sort of up and running. It's split again, Tammy. Can you go back?
I'm sorry. I don't know what's happening with our Zoom today.
Maybe it's the rain. Yeah, it did it again.
Oh my goodness.
Okay, here it is. Yep.
Okay, so there's our workshop. We do hope you'll join us, everyone. Let's try this again.
Awesome. So today, here are our objectives. We'll clarify key vocabulary to support MTSS evidence-based practices. And we'll learn about data protocols and examine how data informs our work in all implementation stages of MTSS. All right, Tammy, I'm going to kick it over to you, and it's doing that split again.
Oh, well, luckily this is just the agenda slide. So hopefully Zoom will cooperate with us a little bit better. But again, thank you everyone for joining us. Happy Teacher Appreciation Week to all of you. We're so excited you're here. We're just going to spend a little bit of time reviewing the key learning that we've done in case you haven't been able to join us in the previous webinars. So the first thing, it's still not doing, I see Lauren shaking her head. Oh my goodness. Let's try this again. Let's go slow, everyone. Pardon our technology issues today. No? Oh my goodness.
There you go.
Okay. So this is a word cloud with some words that we chose that we hope you will feel when we're done with this series. So the concept of MTSS, we know, can feel really daunting and really overwhelming to schools. However, we really want you to know that MTSS is doable, which is why we named our in-person workshop. Lauren was just talking about MTSS is doable. But we know it can also be comprehensive with many resources. But we want you to feel like you already have some great things going on in your buildings and you can use those to your advantage. With that being said, we want you to feel like it is totally able to be personalized and that you can adapt this to make it work for your school or district, regardless of your size or the amount of staff members that you have. MTSS is also feasible, and we believe that you don't have to spend a lot of your funds to implement or sustain this framework. Again, regardless of your size or location. This is our definition that you've seen in previous webinars if you've been able to join us. The key words or phrases from this definition that we really want you to pull out or walk away with are anticipating barriers, systematically leveraging school-wide resources, thinking about the whole child, and equitable access. Those terms are really what the MTSS framework is all about. So these are the components of the MTSS framework. We spent a lot of time on these in a previous webinar, but just to quickly review, when we think about curriculum, we are taking into account all building-wide curriculum. So what does it look like? Is it working for students? Are you getting the desired outcomes? When we think about professional development, we're thinking about how often does this occur? What is the quality of it? Is it supporting staff in the way that it needs to? And also thinking about, is it ongoing? Is it consistent? And is it relevant and timely? When we think of positive behavior measures, we want to think about what is the mindset around behavior strategies in our building? What is currently in place? And are these working to support students? Should a tiered system for students, do we have a tiered system for students that works fluidly and flexibly for all of them? In regards to social emotional learning, we want to think about, again, what does this look like? What do we need? Do we have a school-wide curriculum around this? Or do we need one? Is our curriculum based on the 5 pillars from CASEL, which is the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning? And those 5 pillars are self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. We want to think about our response to intervention, or as most of you know it as RTI. So again, how many students is this serving? Is this effective? What can we celebrate and what still needs support? And when we talk about RTI, it could be done through Title I. For some of you that are not Title I schools, it could be your after school or before school supports that you have. And remember, the goal of RTI is to support struggling academic students through a combination of supports. And then student and family involvement. Those are when we are thinking about ways for families to get involved. So there's culture and language liaisons through the Remind app or Class Dojo or ELL specialists. There's things like inventive communication, which is like your newsletters, your social media, your meetings, family advisory teams. We're getting students involved with this too. So it could be a student leadership panel, like your student government systems, Could be collaborative decision-making, for example, through restorative justice practices where students are really part of that discipline process. Could be goal setting with all aspects of MTSS in mind, your behavior, your academics, and your SEL. And then with your accountability measures, we want to think about what data do we have? What are we using? What do we need more of? And what is the data not telling us? And we're going to talk about accountability a little bit more throughout this webinar today as well, because that really flows in with evidence-based practices and data, as we're talking about here. And then finally, school and community engagement. So, this could be things like local businesses sponsoring education nights at the school, things that foster positive relationships between family and community with communication or academic outcomes. The key with this is that you really want to build that feeling of support between the school and community where parties really feel like they're working together. So I'm going to toss this back to Lauren for a minute, and she's going to review the teams with us.
Tammy, as I start to talk about teams, would you mind Xing out of the PowerPoint and trying to come back in because it keeps splitting? But I will keep moving ahead. Now it's fine, but I don't know. It might be worth just Xing out and reloading it, but I will talk about teams. So the Venn diagram that we put together for you will look familiar if you've joined us before. And this diagram illustrates both the district leadership team and also the building leadership team, which we'll refer to as the Tier 1 team as we move through this series. These teams have roles in both the executive and implementation functions of MTSS, and they work together to assess readiness. So we talked a lot last time about assessing readiness. These are the two main teams that will be doing that. Additionally, both teams work together to consider resources and take inventory of resources that your school district has, or each individual school within a district has access to. These teams will determine how these resources can or cannot support MTSS. The Tier 2 and 3 team responsibilities. So this team supports social, emotional, behavioral, and academic needs for students and focuses on increasing the intensity and scope of supports for students, which may include a focus on a few targeted skills, increased instructional time, as two examples, right? So this team also ensures that the process, the Tier 1 process has been followed, right? Before we are going to refer students to Tier 2, we need to make sure that the Tier 1 process has been followed and that, students have had an opportunity for Tier 1 instruction in all of those areas and support. This team uses data to determine when students need to access Tier 2 or Tier 3, what supports are needed, which staff will deliver those supports, and this team will also determine the process for that progress monitoring that will occur. This team consults with teaching staff to provide ongoing support for students who are requiring different levels of intervention. And also this team will coordinate with any community services for students who need intervention. So an example for this would be like mental health. So this team would, if you don't have a mental health counselor in your building, this team would connect with mental health resources in your community if that is what a student needs. In terms of the stages of MTSS implementation, we talked a lot about that. This is really a main focus for us last time. So in that first stage, we are calling it exploration, readiness, self-assessment. So it's a very early stage of early implementation, and it's collecting data about your readiness as a school or a district as you embark on this work. So there was the readiness checklist that we talked about. We're going to show it to you again in just a minute as a visual reminder, but working through those different areas of school climate, leadership, Tier 1 practices. The next phase is the planning and the goal setting. So this is an important stage in MTSS implementation because it's really going to help you leverage the readiness results and plan the next steps. Initial implementation. So this is where you can start with a small initial implementation in regards to a priority area. So you're going to use your data, and we'll talk a lot about that in a few minutes, but we're going to use that data and we're going to decide where we need to really hone in and focus, right? It may be behavioral, it may be academic, but we'll let data help us with that. And we'll also use feedback, right, from our stakeholders to determine, that area of focus. And then in full implementation, once you have a good working cycle down with the initial implementation and that smaller, the small priority area that you've honed in on, you can layer in other areas and move to that full implementation. That takes time, and that's certainly not meant to happen within one school year, right? This is 2, 3, 4, 5 years of working through these cycles with your teams to really get that up and running. And then this last piece of review for us today, this looks familiar to you. For those that have joined, this is that readiness checklist that I just mentioned. So it includes indicators for school culture, your leadership team's schedule, budgeting, staffing, data use, and the tier 1 classroom practices, right? So we want to see, what is fully in place, what's partially in place, and what of those indicators in those categories we are just not there yet, right? It's not in place. And then we also included in that a resource inventory that schools and districts can use. So we're going to move into key vocabulary, and Tammy will take it from here.
Yes, thank you, Lauren. All right, so these vocab terms here that you see on your screen, these five terms are really the foundation for the topic of our webinar today, which we know is evidence-based practices and data. So we're going to be discussing these terms more in depth throughout this first portion of the webinar. So let's jump right in. All right, so evidence-based practices. So this is a widely used adjective in education. It refers to any concept or strategy that is derived from or informed by objective evidence. Most commonly, educational research or metrics of school and teacher performance are where we get this evidence-based practice from. Among the most common ones are those evidence-based decisions, evidence-based school improvement, evidence-based instruction. Like, you hear this term so frequently as well. So the related modifiers are data-based, research-based, and scientifically based, and they're used when the evidence in question consists largely or entirely of data, academic research, and scientific findings. So basically, what that is a fancy way of saying is, when we think about evidence-based anything, practices, school improvement, instruction, whatever, researchers have studied that impact in a controlled setting. So here we have an image from John Hattie, and he is, for those of you I'm sure very familiar, but he's an educational researcher that looked at evidence-based practices that impact student learning and outcomes. And so we're going to explore some evidence-based strategies in our next webinar in regards to the academics, the behavior, and the social emotional stuff. But we did just want to give you a quick example of one in regards to academics. So we can see here that formative evaluation is at the top of Hattie's list. And a really important piece that goes along with formative assessment is feedback. And so formative assessments can give us as teachers feedback about our learners, for sure. But we also want to make sure that we are providing feedback to the learners because they need the feedback as much as we as teachers do.
Hey, Tammy, can I jump in for a quick sec?
Sure.
Mind just going backwards, just one? And I don't know if, for those of you that may not know who John Hattie is, he's that handsome Australian guy that did the meta-analysis and came up with the top 200 factors that have the most impact on teaching and learning. So his research is a great place to go to find research-based practices. And so here, what you're looking at is the effects of, this is, he divides them into different categories. So this is the effect sizes for the teaching and learning strategies that he analyzed, right? And I mean, I'm just gonna, if it's okay, you guys, so anything over 0.4, you see the numbers on the right, anything over 0.40 leads to more than a year's growth for a student. So these at the top, right, are your really, really high impact strategies. So just wanted to point that out. So he's a great place to go to for evidence-based practices.
He's also written a number of books just to go along with what Karen's saying. Visible Learning is one of them. It's quite fantastic if you haven't read it. So that's just
Thank you, Jeremy.
Yes. All right. So like I said, we were talking about feedback being really important. And so feedback is not just a number or a letter grade. So it's also not advice or just evaluation or praise that we give kids. Meaningful feedback really provides students with personalized, specific information about their performance and their learning. So feedback isn't when you try to justify a grade for a kid, but rather you want to have really good positive reinforcement and constructive criticism that's focused on helping those students understand how to improve or how to expand their thinking. So it's really tailored to the learner and to the specific assignment. It's relevant and timely. It is specific, and you're also leaving the learner with specific goals when you are giving them feedback. And I've linked you to, there's a quote here on the bottom of your screen that sort of sums all of that up, where it's, you know, it's really positive and supportive. And the Digital Promise website, when you get a copy of this, you'll be able to go to it, and it is a fabulous resource where you can get all kinds of specific strategies and things to help support learners. And we'll probably reference it again in webinar 5. So here again, we can see John Hattie. We love him. These are his effect sizes for behaviors. So as we know in MTSS, behaviors, academics, and social emotional learning all work in tandem with each other. So in other words, they all impact each other, right? So notice here again, Hattie notes that teacher-student relationships are one of the biggest influencers on student achievement. And so this is why MTSS is such a vital framework for student success in our schools. As with our academic example, we're going to just dig into this very briefly. So I'm going to flip to the next slide. So just a second ago, we were talking about that providing meaningful and timely feedback to students, which not only comes with the benefit of academic success for them, but it also really helps build trusting relationships between students and teachers. And another way that teachers can build relationships with students is to do this through fostering a sense of community and belonging using social emotional learning techniques. And this too comes with its own sets of benefits, as we see listed here on this slide. So it could be educational success, motivation increases, student engagement goes up, kids are more invested in the tasks at hand. So these are all great things. These are all things that we really want to see from our kids. And the quote you see here on the screen is from Dr. DeLon Gray. He is a professor at North Carolina State College, and he studied the impact of learning environments on student achievement and outcomes. And we've linked you to the article that he wrote in the resource section at the end of our slides that we'll talk about, but it was called "Why is it important for students to feel a sense of belonging at our school?" And he really talks more about this in that resource. It's not very long, but it's a really impactful one. So we wanted you to have it. And here, these are all places where you can find evidence-based practices and reviews, and they're all objective. So they're not companies promoting their specific program or their specific curriculums, but these are all objective looks. So we have CASTLE, which we mentioned a number of times throughout this webinar series, but that one helps grow social and emotional learning from promising theories that are an essential part of education. It's a nonprofit, nonpartisan website. The Florida Center Reading Research. Here, educators can find resources to support knowledge and practice. It empowers you as educators to use their resources to make those evidence-informed decisions to help improve student outcomes. What Works Clearinghouse. This is an Institute of Education Sciences, and it's from the U.S. Department of Education. So again, they're independent, they're nonpartisan. Their mission is to provide scientific evidence on which to ground education practice and policy. Achieve the Core. Some of you are probably very familiar with that. That is in partnership with passionate change makers. They really work to design tools and resources and professional learning and other supports that are grounded in research and the realities of the classroom, right? Which is really important if we're going to look at things. We have Ed Reports, where their mission is to increase the capacity of teachers, administrators, and leaders who are looking for high quality instructional materials to ensure students at all levels receive an excellent education. Then there's the Visible Learning Meta-Analysis, which Karen was alluding to a few minutes ago, powered by John Hattie and that Visible Learning Research. So he really aims to help close the gap between the research of what works best for student achievement and the power of visible learning, which lies in helping educators understand, measure, and evaluate the impact on student growth and achievement. There's the Best Evidence Encyclopedia, which is a free website created by Johns Hopkins University of Education. And it is really intended to give educators and research fair and useful information about the strength and evidence supporting a variety of programs for grades K to 12. Then there is the evidence for ESSA. So they work to maximize the impact of practice and educational leaders in a straightforward way. The website for them is really aimed to help identify programs, provide free, authoritative, user-centered databases to help anyone, whether it's schools or districts or state leaders, teachers, parents, concerned citizens, any of them find those programs in practice grounded in the evidence. And finally, there's the Blueprints for Healthy Youth Development. So their mission is really to provide a comprehensive registry of scientifically proven interventions that prevent or reduce the likelihood of antisocial behavior and really promote a healthy course of youth development into adult maturity. And again, everything for them is evidence-based and has high scientific standards of evaluating what works in social and crime prevention interventions. So those are just a few resources you can go to for some of these evidence-based practices. So here we have another term, fidelity. Probably very familiar. We hear this a lot in education as well. When we think of fidelity, it's really a faithfulness to a person, cause, or belief demonstrated by continuing loyalty and support. When we think of this in terms of education, we think about how closely prescribed procedures are followed and the degree to which educators are implementing programs or assessments or plans. In regards to specific curricular programming, thinking about, are we implementing our instruction as it's intended? For example, if we're using Eureka or Wonders Literacy, what's our time frame? What's our methodology? We have to think about fidelity in regards to a process. So are we implementing this in the way it's supposed to be? Are we implementing our data protocols, which Lauren's going to talk to us about in a few minutes? Are we conducting our meetings according to our norms? When we think about fidelity in terms of an intervention, we have to think about, are we following through with lunch bunch, which might be a social emotional practice that we have, or reciprocal teaching, which is an academic strategy in the way that it's intended. And finally, are we thinking about fidelity in regards to our system? Meaning, are we implementing our referral system the way that it's meant to or that we committed to? Are we adhering to our PLC process? So those are all ways that we need to think about fidelity. And then the quote you see here on the screen is from our wonderful PD director, Karen. So Karen, I didn't know if you wanted to speak a little bit more about this quote before we move on to the next term. I think you're muted though, Karen. Oh, Karen, you're muted. Sorry, everyone.
Yeah, I'm a little embarrassed about my name on the quote, but the point is, it's not like it's a profound quote, but the issue of fidelity is always an interesting one for me. I'm inherently not a rule follower, so the word fidelity is kind of like, I don't love fidelity to programs or, but I think what I want to point out here in that quote is, in MTSS, if we want to measure the efficacy of something, we have to absolutely know what that input was, right? So you can't take a kid, like just on a small scale level. There's no point. A lot of times, if you're at a middle school or a high school, you'll look back on a kid's folder, their history, and you'll say, oh, well, that kid got the Linda Bell program for 3 years and he still can't read and it didn't work. Clearly that didn't work, And so I think the thing that we have to be careful of is, was the specific program implemented the way it was intended to be implemented? Do we understand what the input was in any given situation? You can't conclude that PLCs, for example, if that's a system and you try it out as part of your MTSS, right? Which I hope personally everyone has real PLCs. You can't say that PLCs don't work unless you've implemented them, right? The way that is research-based, that Richard Dufour and his lovely wife laid out for us, and try that. And then if you've implemented it the way it's supposed to be implemented and you still find it's not working for your population or for a given student or for your staff, then you have the freedom to start to make adjustments to tailor it so that it meets the needs of your community. And I just want to say one more thing about this. It's okay when we talk about fidelity to not be working off a program. If you're not using a piece of curriculum, maybe you've designed an intervention yourself as an interventionist, but you still need to measure its efficacy. So whatever you intended or whatever you've conveyed as whatever the intervention or the system might be, make sure that you do it with fidelity so that you can tell whether it was effective, so that then you can go back and make adjustments. I'm done. Thanks.
Thank you, Karen.
Long.
All right. So when we think about accountability, we think about accountability for ourselves, our students, our frameworks, our teams. So strong accountability systems create a clear expectation that schools use to measure progress. Accountability is what we think of when we think about focusing our attention on resources. And we need to ensure that accountability isn't limited to just the lowest performing schools. And I know Lauren's going to spend some time with accountability too in regards to data. So we won't spend too much time on this, but when we think about student accountability, we want to hold students accountable for their goal setting, for their self-assessment, for their reflection and revision through things like portfolios or student-led conferences, things like that. When we think about teacher accountability, we want to think about holding them accountable for their high impact instruction. So strategies or ways that we could think about that would be through observations or instructional rounds of peer observations. Staff, though, we are accountable as a staff for all students in our building. It's not those are your students, these are my students mindset. We are really accountable for all students. For team accountability, we want to think about following through with our missions, our goals, and our purposes. So Karen was just talking about PLC practices. We also want to think about, our action planning templates or our team notes or our norms. And then for the school or district accountability, we want to think about, are they holding the district or school accountable for pursuing standards for all students? Thinking about analyzing that disaggregated longitudinal assessment results or supervision of administration even. And the quote here is from Bob Proctor, who's the author of numerous books and studies. And he's participated in a number of educational podcasts as well. He also studied social emotional learning along with many other subjects. And he is actually considered the world's foremost expert on the human mind. So we've linked you to some stuff from him in the resources as well. And then progress monitoring, which is frequent ongoing assessment and reflection that really informs our direction towards goals, right? So for student achievement, it could be pre and post assessments, interim assessments within a unit, could be exit and entry tickets, anything where you're tracking growth over time. For student behavior, it could be behavior charting or student self-reflections. When we think about it in terms of ourselves as educators, it could be that goal setting we do. Lauren's going to talk to you about SMART goals in a little bit. So it could be that, or it could be those team self-assessment tools. And then in regards to our systems and framework, it could be trimester reviews of our action planning steps, or it could be thinking about where are we in this MTSS framework? How are things going, etc. And then efficacy is the last one that was on that list that we started with, right? So when we think of efficacy, it's really meaning, measure, and impact on student achievement. So those are the big things with the general definition of efficacy. It really answers the question, are we helping the students that we serve? So when we think about it in terms of self-efficacy, it's the belief in our ability to effectively handle tasks or obligations or challenges that are related to our professional activity. It plays a key role in influencing our academic outcomes like student achievement and motivation, our working environment, our personalities, and our growth mindset. And then when we think of collective efficacy, again, we're going back to John Hattie because we just love him so, and he's so great. But he, it's that shared belief system that Lauren and I talked to you about in a previous webinar about the collective why. And research has demonstrated that in schools where there is that high degree of collective efficacy, teachers actually have a much more positive attitude about professional development. They have deeper implementation of these evidence-based practices we're talking about, and student behavior is also improved. And so it really goes back to that readiness that we referenced before and that Lauren talked about briefly in our review of key learning. Are we getting the desired results? And is our school ready to embark on this process? So with that, we'll just pause for a second to see if there's any questions in the chat or the Q&A. You had a lot of information given to you, so we just wanted to pause for a moment before I toss it over to Lauren.
No question.
All right. So I don't see any questions. No. So Lauren, I'm going to turn it over to you to hop in to talk to us about data then.
Sounds great. All right. There we go. Awesome. Okay. This may look familiar to some folks from this first webinar. If not, that's totally fine. I'll talk about it. So in this second part of the presentation, we're going to talk about data use in the 4 stages of MTSS. And we're also going to discuss the data cycle, how the data cycle applies to examining data by using a data-driven dialogue that will help inform our work and help us to set goals. So we'll talk about this cycle, and then we'll talk about a data-driven dialogue to help our work in this cycle. So we know that data takes all different shapes and forms, and sometimes we tend to think of data coming from summative assessments, right? Our state level assessments, but really data comes from all facets, right, of our work. So we want to think about formal and informal collection of data as you go through building this framework, right? You have access to a lot of data, right? So we will use data to support students who may be, again, at risk or on the other end, gifted, right? In MTSS, we're supporting all students of all abilities. Data comes from the voices of our staff. We have to remember to include staff, students, family, and our community, right, as it applies to what you're working on, your school-wide goal, in terms of getting data from them as well. So this is an image of the data cycle that we're going to work through, again, in all the stages. So first we collect our data. We could use universal screeners such as DIBELS, the NWEA. We could look at attendance. We could look at our behavior records. Then we'll analyze our data. So we'll examine the results of the data collection, and we'll ask ourselves what we notice about this data. What is it telling us? What is it not telling us, right? So teams will spend some good time, in this stage of the data cycle. And then next we implement. So we're thinking about our area of focus. So again, maybe our school is going to focus on behavior, right? So we're going to think about that area and what are we going to do about it, right? So what are we going to implement to support our students in the behavioral realm, okay? And so we're implementing strategies and supports based on all of that data that we're collecting. We're not going to look at one data point there. We're going to look at several data points. And then finally, we evaluate and we reflect. So how are the strategies working? Are they working? Are they not working? Are they working partially, but not fully like we want them to? What's missing, right? So, our team time will help us through this cycle. So our leadership team or that tier 1 team will use this cycle. Our PLCs at grade level will use this cycle. The tier 2 and 3 teams will use this cycle. And different teams may be in different places, right? Because they may be working on different things. So your tier 2, 3 team is going to be working again more intensely on supports, right? So they're going to use this data, but they have different data points than your tier 1 team, right? So regular meetings, again, progress monitoring, we've been talking about that, very important to determine, again, how is all of this working, right? We're constantly evaluating, we're constantly collecting, so we're moving in this cycle and this becomes part of the way we work. This cycle can also be applied to the implementation of the framework in general, right? So the MTSS framework in general. So for example, the leadership team will come back to that readiness checklist that we talked a little bit about earlier in this webinar. So they're going to come back to that as you work through different aspects of implementation. So think about your teaming, for example, right? There were several indicators under teaming. You indicated that certain things were fully in place, partially in place, or not at all. So you're going to keep coming back to that, right, as your guide. So things that are fully in place, how are they working, right? Are our protocols working the way we want them to? We thought they were fully in place, but are they really, right? What's partially in place? What are we going to focus on? So you're constantly coming back into this cycle as you work through the different stages of MTSS. And you'll see this. We have another cycle that's very similar to this, and I'll explain the connection to them in just a minute. So for this next slide, we're going to move into data use in the different stages. So as we look at stages of implementation, we have compiled what we think are important questions for you to answer around data and how you will use data in each stage of implementation. We will offer you some ideas in the next couple of slides. So they're set up. I just want to let you know the slides are set up with questions, right? And so we're going to offer ideas of what data you can leverage to answer the questions. You may be thinking of other things, right, that come to mind when you see a question come up. So I'm going to talk you through these questions, and then I'm going to offer some examples of what data you can pull. So that's sort of the format for the next few slides as we go through the different stages. So in terms of stage 1, it's that exploration and readiness. If we're thinking about academics, where does our academic focus need to be, right? So to answer this, we can consider sources that provide us with that longitudinal data. So we're going to look at some state assessment. We can look at universal assessments. That might include the MCAS if you're in Massachusetts, the New Hampshire SAS, that statewide assessment system. Again, NEWA, the NWEA, STAR assessment. You may be using your Performance Plus online reporting system. So that's just a student assessment system that we can use to manage student progress. So you may be using that to access your data. Schools may also use course grades, right, and common local assessments to gather some of this information. In terms of the social, emotional, and behavior, where does our focus really need to be? So again, we can look at office referrals for data. We can look at attendance. So we can consider absenteeism. We could consider truancy, and we can consider tardiness, right? All under attendance for students. We could look at classroom level behaviors that maybe haven't escalated to office referrals yet, but teachers are commenting about classroom level behaviors being impactful for learning. So we can look at that. Classroom observations, where we can focus on assessing student agency, student engagement, and student collaboration. Demographics, how do demographics of our school impact the needs of our students? So again, we can look at the SIS, so that's the student information system that you have. We can collect feedback through community focus groups. So again, you're inviting parents in, inviting family in, take their feedback through survey, through dialogue, and use that feedback. And also for our New Hampshire schools that are on the call, you can use the iPlatform database, which is through the Department of Education. So if you're not familiar with that database provides school and district data for all New Hampshire schools all across the state. It's essentially like a report card for each school. So in the spirit of transparency and accessibility, the data is available to everyone in the state, and you can look at your school. You can look at, if you're in a district with multiple schools, you could compare your school, your elementary school, for example, with another one across town, but in the same district. You can compare your school to the neighboring town. So there's a lot of wonderful, useful information in there that you can definitely use for data use in MTSS, and specifically in stage 1. And then funding, how are we allocating resources? You have to know that, right? So to secure this, you need to access your business director and or your title funds manager, for example. So on the next slide here, again, we're still in stage 1. There's just a lot of questions to answer. There's a lot of things we need to know, right? You don't have to go in this order. You can pick and choose, but, program efficacy, we've talked about this, what programs have been the most and the least effective in improving your learning. So again, we want to look at longitudinal data, but we want to disaggregate by program, right? So we want to just separate. You've got your academic, your SEL, your behavior. We can look at, again, our state and local assessments, grades across time, over time, culture in your school. How is our community poised for the challenge of change, right? So this is really important because this is a lot of work. So to help answer this question, you might, again, go to survey data. Again, you have your focus groups. Wherever, we've talked about this too in the series, wherever you can bring students into your work, it will be a meaningful experience for both students and staff and families, and their voice is important, right? That's really why we're here doing the work that we do. So folding in students whenever possible to get this information, to get this data is important. And then number 7, tier 1 classroom practices. What are the best practices we can build on in our classroom, right? So tier 1 classroom practices, you can gather this by observations. Having a tier 1 observation tool is really important. So you can do this with administration coming through for observations. You can do this by peer observation, right? Get your teachers out, have them at different grade levels, have them at the same grade level observing what their colleagues are doing. So, so there's a lot of way to get that information. And then in terms of professional development, what has been successful and what gaps exist for teacher knowledge. So we need to, again, go through our instructional rounds here. We need to consider, our observations of teachers and talk about when we have that post-observation conference with a teacher or a post-observation survey. This is where we can gather some of that data. So we're moving into stage 2, right? And so that's that planning and goal setting. So this is where, we're cyclically looking at the data that we just described, we just talked about in stage 1. In stage 2, we're going to begin to ask questions that will help us, determine and narrow our focus. And so remember that you're going to start small, right? You're starting with one area. So first, we will consider what data we want to look at to decide on that area of focus. It might be academic, it might be behavioral or social emotional. And where are you starting? Are you starting with curriculum and instruction, with professional development and strategies in these areas? Are you starting with students? So, one area, focus in this particular stage, right? Then we will consider what data we are going to use to show evidence of growth or goal attainment, right? So we're going to set goals here. So if we are starting with behavior, data collection might include, again, the office referrals, your attendance record, your majors, your minors, those classroom level behaviors that don't quite get to the office yet, right, that we just mentioned. And next, we need to talk about multiple measures of accountability. So where are they needed? Remember that we're trying to build a strong accountability system in MTSS. So if we're focusing on behavior and the overall climate in our school, do we have accountability from all the stakeholders, right? The staff, your students, folks at the district level, right? Community members, parents. So keeping that voice, right, in mind for all your stakeholders. We also need to ask ourselves if teams and educators know how to use the data to create SMART goals to move the process along. So in just a couple of minutes, we will spend just a slide or two on SMART goals, and we'll discuss this a little bit further, but they're really important in this work that we're talking about. And so finally, we actually did touch upon number 5 in the protocol, the teaming and protocol part of our second webinar. But making sure that your stakeholders have access to the data they need, and also making sure that they know the skills that are needed to use the data effectively is essential, right? So this is really something, again, comes from protocols with your team. So this is something that building leadership team needs to help put in place and follow up as well. So where is the data housed, right? Can your educators access this data? Do they know what to do with the data? Can they interpret the data, right? So it's really important that you have all of that accessible for folks, right? And explained. In stage 3, the stage 3 is that initial implementation. So the first question that we think is important for stage 3, what progress are students making as we strengthen tier 1 instruction? So we might consider data again from instructional rounds, observations, teacher self-assessments, universal data again. We can look at formative data that we're collecting with our students, attendance, behavior referrals, and then student self-assessment data, right? That's really important. So we can look at that as well as we're considering strengthening tier 1. What progress are students making in the interventions we are initiating? So how do we figure this out? So when we are considering the progress students are making, we can use observations, teacher assessments. We can chart weekly dipsticks. So examples of that would be like looking at small formative assessments throughout the week, right? And collecting that data. So student reflections, exit tickets, perhaps dialogue with your students. So again, Tammy talked about feedback. How about short focused discussions between student and teacher to get student feedback, to give student feedback, right? We can also use interim assessments or behavior plan data, just as a couple of examples. And then the third question here, what progress are we making in implementing our articulated systems with Fidelity? So our data sources could be from a regular review of our school-wide strategic plan, right? So every school has a plan. Come back to that. We want to come back to our plan. Are we on track, right? We can also get this data from collecting artifacts and looking at our artifacts as we go through. What are we producing, right? We can look at all of that. And then just 2 more questions here. What progress are we making in improving professional development to meet the needs of teachers? Really important, right? So to answer this question, we're going to look at data. Again, we're going to instructional rounds, observations to see evidence of application, right? So how are our teachers doing with the training that we've provided for them? We need to focus in on our feedback surveys from teachers. Again, just like we talked about in the last slide, having short, focused conversations with our students, we need to do those with our teachers too, right? So there's a lot of value there. Teacher self-assessments, focusing on their own learning goals is really important, and having them, keep coming back to those goals. So those are just some examples of ways you could collect data there. And then finally, what progress are we making in creating a culture that can manage the change, right? So we need to create it, we need to manage it, we need to sustain it. So here we can use environmental walks in our building. We can use perception surveys. Again, keep in mind, you've got your stakeholders, right? All of your stakeholders, your focus groups, attendance data, again, office referral. So, you've heard some similar examples, and that's okay, right? So several of these resources are powerful sources of data for you to use, and you can use them across all the stages. And a lot of what we've shared in terms of data use here and the resources you can use, you have access to, right? You're already using these data points in different ways, right? So just kind of helping you put it together a little bit. So in stage 4, we're gonna wrap here. In stage 4, again, it's full implementation. So you've got a good working cycle down at this point. This is far out, right? This is far out. So a couple of years, right? We're layering in additional areas to focus. So we started with behavior. We're going to turn our sights to academics. We're thinking ELA. So we're going in that direction. And then again, we're going back to these questions from stage 1, 2, and 3. Every time we're adding in, we're layering in, we're coming back to these questions and finding this data, right? Takes time. So this is a data-driven dialogue. I'm going to just talk to you about this image here that's on your screen. It looks familiar. It is. We're moving through different phases of data here, and of dialogue as we examine data. So instead of 4 points, there's 5 here, right? You can use this protocol with your teams for local benchmark assessments for longitudinal data when you're reviewing. You can use it when you're looking at your demographic data, your survey data, right? So this is just good dialogue to get in the habit of, right? To make it part of how you look at data. So I won't spend too long here, but I know we need to make predictions in phase 1, right? What are we hoping to learn, expecting to see from the data? What assumptions do you have? We all sometimes have assumptions, right? So what are the assumptions you have looking at the data? We want to observe the data in phase 2, right? So we want to think about when we observe the data, we don't actually want to make assumptions here, right? We just want to see, what are you noticing here? And, don't come to any conclusions yet. So we also want to really try to be like precise and quantitative. So in this phase, you could look at data and go, students did bad on that, right? But what we want you to think about doing is saying something like, 20% of students did poorly on whatever it may be, because when we don't make it precise and we don't quantify, then it can help feed confusion and anxiety and frustration as you're going through data, which sometimes can be overwhelming, right? Phase 3, interpreting data and making inferences. We're going to generate possible explanations. We're going to ask further questions, right? We're going to look for relationships here, inferences related to our student learning. Implications for practice in stage 4. We're going to seek to find connections between what the data suggests is working, what needs to change, and what's missing, right? We can reflect and focus on our practices to improve student learning. And then finally, reflection. This is the final step to review the process. And this is really important, right? This piece of reflection, what went well through this process, right? What could be improved? What new learning do you have about this data? How has your thinking changed, right? How will you use this information that we've just worked through to improve your practice? And so this is a SMART goal. I'm not going to spend too much time here. We need to wrap up. But this is all coming to you. Just a review of SMART goals. So once we've gone through this data, right, we need to create a goal, right? So crafting a SMART goal is important because it is specific, it is measurable, right? It is a goal that is achievable and relevant, and of course, time bound. So we encourage you to use this framework. And if you're able to join us on our 2-day workshop, we're going to be doing some of this work with you. So we'd like you to use this process as you're looking at your data. And then finally, this last piece, and then we're going to just put our survey link up, is just an image of a planning tool. You could create your own. You could use something just like this if you wanted to, but essentially you are looking at, your current situation that you have, that area of focus. You're going to create your SMART goal. How are you measuring it? What are you using, right? So if it's a behavior goal, are you using your SIS to help you out with that, right? How are you going to measure it? Are you using feedback surveys? We're going to hone in on action steps here, that method for monitoring, right? How are you going to support the action step? What are you going to use? We're going to put an expected completion date, right? So we want to have, that's got to be time bound, right? And then who's responsible, right? So who will help in the accountability piece of this stage of goal setting? Wowzer. That's it. That's enough. So
it was great.
So much information. Thanks for hanging on for 2 extra minutes. Tammy, can you keep moving forward here? We're going to pop that link in the chat real quick. Tammy, can you grab that?
Yes, I can.
And just if you want to move forward here.
Oops.
Thank you for filling out the survey, everybody. It's important to us because then we can make changes.
All right. Thanks, Tammy. And if you wouldn't mind just moving forward, you could. Thanks. So again, remember, we have one more webinar. We're going to talk about supporting students on the continuum, and that is May 18th at 3:15. And then we do have our 2-day workshop that we talked a little bit about in the beginning. So when you get, you may have already received it in your email, but again, when you get this, you'll be able to, this slide, you'll be able to click on the slide and register. Right. So we've heard from several of you so far with interest, and we are hoping that you're able to join us, and we'll help you kind of kickstart here so that you're ready to do some work over the summer with your teams and then get started when you get back to school. Again, resources coming your way. Contact us. Many of you have, and we love it. So keep contacting us. We're here to answer any questions. We're also happy to give you a phone call as well if you want to talk further. There are some questions in the chat. So I think what we'll do is wrap up, and we're happy to hang on and address those questions in the chat or those comments. So I haven't looked at them yet, but Karen, if you want to sift through them, those who need to leave, thank you so much.
We're okay, Laura.
We're okay.
Yeah, no big questions.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining. We'll see you next time.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Take care, everybody.